So first of all, I want to recognize Alexander Dubyansky, the wonderful Russian scholar who contributed so much to the study of Tamil traditions, and we miss him very much. And this is a presentation in his memory and to honor him. And as you can see from the first image here on the screen, I've studied this story for 50 years. And the ending of the story has always troubled me because not only do the significant characters die, but they die in a violent way by a piercing. And particularly the three characters you see on the left who are lying on the ground, those are the two great brothers in the story who are twins. And the man closer to the bottom of the screen is their primary assistant. Sometimes he's called the first minister. He has some magical qualities and he's very important. And this is an image when they, we would say in English, but it's not quite the right term, they commit suicide. They jump onto the points of their own swords. And the twin brothers do that first, and then the assistant follows suit and says, well, my masters have committed their lives and now I must follow and commit mine. So it's in a sense, a sort of a sad and shocking ending. And I've tried for many, many years to understand what is really being said, what is behind this ending for the story. So that is what my lecture is about. And I'm trying, through focusing on this ending, to look at some of the larger issues surrounding death and afterlife and what is the meaning of the heroes in the story in a broad sense. So first, because most of you are not aware, I think, of this epic, which I did publish in 1992 from Chennai in 2 volumes that had the Tamil text on one side and the English on the other. That's been long out of print. It's extremely difficult to access and very expensive now because people have, put up the price because it's rare. So I finally decided that I need to bring out a new edition. So this is what the cover of the new edition is going to look like. And it's only English now. I'm hoping to bring out a matching Tamil volume soon, but it was too difficult to try to maneuver 2 volumes. People would buy one and not the other, and it got confusing. So this time the entire story is in 1 volume. It's a paperback, so hopefully it won't be that expensive. And this is what it will look like. It's coming out, I hope, by Christmas this year. The publisher is telling me it's being paginated right now, and it hopefully will go into print very soon. So if you're curious about the story, it will soon be accessible. For a long time, I have worked with trying to animate the story and also produce a graphic novels, would make it more accessible and more visual to people who wanted to read it, because it's hard, particularly for people who don't have a lot of background in this tradition, to imagine very clearly and very accurately of what's happening. So for that, I was very fortunate to find this wonderful man, Ravichandran Arumugham, who was raised in a village very near the village where I collected the story in 1965. And he is the grandson of a singer, of an actual folk bard who wandered the countryside telling this story. And he used to sit on his grandfather's knee and hear the story over and over again as a young child. So the story was already really embedded in his heart long before I met him. And he's also, by passion, a storyteller and an animator. He tells me that before I met him as a village boy, he wanted to be a storyteller. And so he would take the ordinary earth mud in front of his small hut where he lived, and he would fashion characters from it, dry them in the sun, paint them, and then call all of his friends and tell stories by moving these characters around in his front yard, front patio. So this was his passion from very, very early in life. And even though his father wanted him to make money and tried to send him to be an accountant, he hated accounting, and he said, no, I want to be a storyteller and an artist. So he ran away to Chennai. Somehow he found someone who would teach him kind of under the covers at night how to animate. He pulled himself up that way and began working for small local graphic companies. And then finally, when I found him, I said, let me try to bring you to Canada to work with me to animate this story. He jumped at the chance, and the rest of the story unfolds from there. I'm telling you this because all the illustrations you will see, with the exception of a few things you will recognize as photographs or extracts from books and so on, but mainly all the illustrations are due to this wonderful artist. And I was so fortunate because these illustrations are so genuine. They come from his imagination, from his heart. They're not things that I told him to draw. They're things that he said, this is the way I want to illustrate this part of the story. These are some of the major trade routes that ran from the West Coast across this internal area called Kongu Nadu. This is important because unlike the Chera, Pandya, and Chola kingdoms, who had a lot of influence from other cultures, and especially from Vedic and Brahmanic culture coming from the north, this area called Kongu Nadu remained relatively isolated. And it was never ruled by any significant line of kings. These three kingdoms, the Chola, Chera, and Pandya, all kind of squabbled over it, and its dominance over the area changed hands many times. But in fact, it never solidified. And Kongu has always had this kind of independent identity. And it's also the case that this area is kind of a high plain with a major river, the Kaveri River, running through it. And so it's identifiable physically and visually as a high plain surrounded roughly by mountains, more so in the west than the east, but there are smaller mountains in the east that give it a kind of circular, local, regional feeling. And that's important because this story, which is called the story of the brothers, or the story of the elder brothers, if you take the point of view of the sister who's said to be a little bit younger than her siblings, although actually she was born with them, so it's actually triplets. They are used as a way of celebrating the identity and the independence of this region. And it therefore retains to this day a identity and a quality that is quite distinctive, and I think has retained some of the more ancient concepts which were overlaid with things coming from the north in the three major kingdoms. So that's background to the story. It's a long story. It's took the bard 38 hours to sing. He sang it over 18 nights. So you can imagine it's a real epic sized story, and there's many interesting things about it. But we're going to talk mainly about the ending of the story. And these two scenes, the first one in which a wild boar is speared, and that happens first. And that's why I was asking about boar hair, because the hair on the ridge of the boar's back is particularly coarse, and it stands up, especially so when the boar is upset or angry. And those hairs are magical. And secondly, after the boar dies, the two heroes commit suicide by falling on their own swords, and so does this very important assistant. The heroes are on a boar hunt. They're hunting this boar who has a name, and he actually can speak in Tamil to his adversaries, these twin heroes. He is called Komban. Komban means the tusked one, the one with the big white tusks. And he calls himself Raja Komban, which of course means I am the king of the tuskers. So his tusks are very important, but also he's a magical boar with special powers, and these are described in the story. We know that he has a star on his tongue, which I believe links him to an ancient constellation that was known in Babylonia. And I think there were links between Kongu area, trading links between the Kongu area and ancient Mesopotamia. And that's maybe how he got the link to that constellation. He also has a ring in his navel, which makes me think of the medieval Tamil ascetic tradition where the Nath yogis wore huge rings in their ears. And also the long tradition of ascetics being sexually restrained and refusing sexual relations with women. So that fact that it's here in his navel kind of suggests that sense of his power, but also his restraint. And finally, he has a garland of flowers on his tail. And of course, not only do the images of many, many deities in Tamil Nadu wear garlands, as in other parts of India, but they wear garlands around their necks. And here, I think there's a kind of an irony that he has a garland as a divine animal, but the garland is on his tail, which suggests that maybe he's part of some, darker version of divinity, and also that he is eventually going to be sacrificed. So that's the setup here. The main idea on this screen is that Lord Vishnu personally blesses the spear, it's called the great boar spear, before it is thrown and before it kills the boar. They're hunting the boar because the boar has been in the fields. The boar is very angry because the farmers have cut down the many trees that the forest dwellers, who are called Vertavas in the story, they're one form of original or a native community that lives in the hills, and the boar is allied with them. And as the farmers came into the Kongu area, which is part of the story, it is a history of the colonization of this internal area by the Chola kings. And the kings said, go in and plow the land. So that meant they had to cut down the trees, and that, of course, was a real threat to the forest. So the forest dwellers, the hunters, are upset, naturally, and their great protector and their hero is this wild boar, who goes into the farmers' fields and digs up the plants. And that's, of course, something that boars love to do anyway, and farmers don't like them because they tear up the fields. They use their tusks, as it is said in the story, as plows to plow up the land, but to plow it up in a wild and chaotic way. And also, this wild boar tore up the irrigation dam, which was responsible for holding the water for the farming. So he also causes a big flood and ruins the fields. And of course, then the farmers are very angry and they go on a hunt, and eventually they kill the wild boar. Now, here is a scene that the boar has been killed. His carcass has been set up, chopped up by the hero's assistant and laid out in 7 offerings in the forest to the various forest deities there, who are hoped by this set of offerings to be helpful and protective. We won't go into the details of the offerings. What is significant is that there's not much meat on the head of a boar. And so they just cut off the head and set it to one side and focused on the meat. But then, lo and behold, this character appears, and it is Vishnu in disguise, the Lord Vishnu himself. And he comes, but he's dressed as a washerman. And so they think that he's a wandering washerman. What's he doing here in the forest? And he says, I'm here because my wife is pregnant and she's crying out for boar meat. In other words, she has pregnancy cravings and she wants boar meat. So please, I see that there's a head of a boar here and you're not using it as not part of your offering. Let me take the head, please, and give it to my poor wife. So the hero, kind of innocently, not understanding much about the larger significance of this, says, okay, it's all right, you can take the head. And I also here, I'll just mention that there's a little tiny dog. He's said to be the size of one fist. And I shouldn't say he because it's a she. She is very tiny, but she is very fierce. And she actually, prior to the hero spearing the boar, this tiny little dog jumps on the boar and, interestingly, bites his testicles. Well, you can imagine how painful that is for the boar. And so she is in many ways this tiny little dog who's an expression of a broader theme of the power of the female in a hidden way, is responsible for the killing of the boar. Okay, now, here is just a extension of the story I told you a moment ago. The washerman, who's really Vishnu in disguise, that's why his skin is blue, but the hero doesn't recognize that. He asks for the head, and the hero says, yes, that's all right. He drags it off. And he says it's for his wife. Well, Vishnu's first wife is Lakshmi, and I don't think that she was begging for boar meat, but his second wife was Bhumi, the goddess of the earth. And I think it's quite reasonable that Bhumi would have been asking for boar meat. And we'll further understand that as my talk progresses. And then what happens, this is a little bit sort of in between the lines of the story, but it seems only logical that Vishnu, because in the very next scene, he appears at the Kali temple in the forest. She's called Karu Kali, which means the black Kali. And she is the goddess of these Vertava hunters, the Aboriginal hunters who live in the hills around the plains of Kongunadu. There's said to be 100 of these men who are all brothers, and they have one sister whose name is Vira Tangal. Tangal means sister, specifically younger sister, so little sister. But Vira means to be brave and strong and to be warlike. So she is the brave, heroic little sister. And Vishnu comes and directly talks to her and says, now I am going to lead your brothers against the farmers. There's going to be a big battle, and I'm going to lead your brothers. So this is a very important point, a kind of a turning point in the story where the great god Vishnu switches sides. He was for 16 years, as the heroes grew up, helping them, and he appears 26 episodes in the story the way I tell it. Vishnu appears at least once in every episode, sometimes 2 or 3 times, helping the heroes always. And even when the heroes are in conflict with these hunters, he's on the hero's side. But now suddenly, the moment the boar is speared and he appears as the washerman asking for the boar's head, he switches sides, which is very interesting. And from now on until the end of the story, he is supporting the opposition, the challengers, the forest men, and their great mascot, the wild boar. So I believe that the wild boar head is symbolically, at any rate, presented to the goddess Kali, and we will see in a few minutes why that is significant. So now Vishnu leads the army. This happens right after he's taken the boar's head. He leads these forest hunters to the place very close to where the offerings are laid out that we just saw. But the significant thing is he is actually creating a vision. The heroes are here in the foreground preparing to fight. They see these hunters rushing at them with their sticks, and they're preparing to resist, when they see standing on a high rock Vishnu in a vision. And he is creating these hunters from his right hand. So this is what is generally called a Vishvarupa. It's an expression of Vishnu showing his grander form. And I believe it references, although it's not in the text because the text is, told in a very folksy local way, but I believe it's referencing the Bhagavad Gita, where Vishnu says to Arjuna, who sits in the chariot just behind him, and Arjuna is having doubts about whether he wants to fight, and Vishnu says, no, you must, it's your duty, you must go and, defend your family and fight. And here Vishnu is saying the same thing to the farming brothers who are about to fight these Vetava attackers. Different from the Mahabharata, because in the Mahabharata they're fighting their own cousins. Here the enemy is the forest dwelling hunters. But it's all a vision. And they fight for some time, and the fight is described. It looks real, but the battle is illusory. And I try to suggest this by making this screen of this slide blue. It's a vision kind of seen in the sky of multiple beings. Each is an emanation resulting from Vishnu's creative powers. So Vishnu also says to the heroes, this is all there will be. This is the, only, he doesn't number them, but there's only this many hunters. Once you have killed these, that's it. You won't have to fight anymore. So he kind of tells the heroes that it puts a limit to what they have to do. This is just down here in the left corner. This stone carving is to suggest that this idea of the Vishnu providing a vision of his Svarupa as a cosmic creator is a very old concept. This particular image comes from about the 5th century AD. So referencing that, the heroes fight, and when they get to the end and there are no more hunters to confront in this vision that they've had, they say, okay, there's blood on our swords, we better go wash our swords in the nearby river. So they wade into the river to wash their swords, and they hear a sound, which is called a sala, 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 sala sound. And they wonder what it is. And it is actually, although they don't see him, it is Vishnu sitting on a branch above the river. And he has just made himself a bow out of sugarcane and arrows that are made of flowers. So Vishnu then shoots this arrow of flowers at the key twin hero, is the younger twin, which is significant in other contexts because the younger twin is the more violent, the fiercer of the two. And this flowered arrow comes at the chest of the hero and takes his thread, which we can call his sacred thread or his warrior thread. It's his way of trying to assimilate himself. He's actually a farmer, so he's a Shudra. He's not one of the higher castes, but by putting on this thread, he assumes the status of a Kshatriya. Well, this flowered arrow takes off that thread and carries it away. He sees this, he knows what's happened. He's not harmed physically, but he feels that his status and his image, his character has been attacked or changed by the loss of this thread. So he turns to his brother who's beside him in the river, and he says, oh my goodness, this is a sign from Vishnu that we must now take our own lives. And so they climb up a bank right next to the river, and they put their swords with the hilt down in the ground, so they're good and solid. And then each one of them takes a running leap and falls on the tip of the sword, so that we end up with this picture of them lying dead on the ground. This image of the way they managed to pierce themselves by flying, running and jumping, and then flying over their sword is very significant, and we'll come back to that. As soon as they have fallen on their swords and their assistant has followed suit, and he's a lower caste, he's actually a Dalit or an untouchable, a pariah in the traditional caste hierarchy there. And he has used a branch of a tree because he's not allowed to carry a sword because of his low status. So he does the same thing, but he pierces himself with the branch of a tree. Lord Vishnu appears right after that. The three spirits are illustrated by our wonderful artist as three little lights that exit the chests of the three heroes. And he collects these in this tiny little golden box he holds in his left hand. And then he flies up to Lord Shiva in the sky with the spirits of the deceased heroes. This is just to show you that this idea is there in the background, I believe, in many ways in India. This is an illustration I found, an 18th century image from Tibet, where you see the idea of the spirit of the deceased kind of transforming, if you like, into a flying, weightless version of the dead hero, and he is flying up into the sky. Similarly, these hero stones are quite prominent in Tamil Nadu. They commemorate various folk heroes, and you see here the three stages. The hero is fighting against enemies. He obviously dies. He is then carried up to heaven in a small chariot, as if he's flying in that chariot, and maybe perhaps pulled by horses or whatever, and mythical horses. And then once he arrives in heaven, he's being honored by the gods there. So this idea of the spirit being released by the body having been pierced, and then it's rising up and flying with or without the aid of some animal or some chariot up into the sky is an old image. However, there is one momentary resurrection, which is also important. The sister of the heroes, who is very, very important, but we haven't time to go into all of her activities in this talk. But she is very upset when she learns that her brothers have died in the forest. She goes to search for them. On the way, she collects a number of magical liquids and other magical substances in 7 pots. She has a set of tiered pots. She finally finds her brothers, and she starts to sprinkle them with the substances she has brought in her pots. That act on her part, because of her magical qualities, brings the brothers back to life momentarily, and she talks to them and asks them, why, brothers, did you do this? Why don't you come back and join me in our palace? Because they all share and live together in one farm palace. And they say, no, we may not live any longer. Vishnu has told us that the time of our lives is complete, and it's time for someone else to take over leadership and guide the kingdom forward. We are going up to heaven to join Shiva's family, and from there we will try to guard and protect you. So this time Vishnu is not carrying the spirits, but Yemen. The spirits have just kind of come back to the bodies briefly for this resurrection, and then they go back. The brothers lie back down, and Yemen this time takes the spirits back to heaven. And here we have an image of their being received now by the gods, by Shiva and Vishnu, who are a pair. They're brothers-in-law in Tamil tradition, and they, together with Shiva's wife Parvati and Vishnu's sister, who's another form of Parvati, but an earthly form, they all welcome the heroes to join them in Kailas. Following that, the sister performs the final puja, the final goodbye. She builds a small shrine for her 2 brothers to honor them, and then she, again, using sprinkled water, she sprinkles with this leaf she holds in her hand, she honors them and says that their memory will continue on earth. And yes, now in Kongu Nadu, there's many shrines to these heroes, and they are honored with significant large festivals, which we have no time to describe here. Okay, so that gives you an outline of how the story ends. But the big question underneath that outline is, who are these twin heroes? Who do they represent? And are they secretly warrior yogis? And my answer is going to be yes, and that they're emulating, they are remembering the image of the warrior yogis that were quite prominent in India in the medieval period. And that is symbolized, of course, by these threads, by which they claim kshatriya status, and by the swords that they carry. And also, when we look at what these warriors do, they are, kind of classical folk image of warriors. They ride these magnificent horses. They fight lions. They fight these Aboriginal hunters who are their antagonists because they are arguing over who should control the land and the forests. And interestingly, the swords that these heroes carry are blessed several times by their sister. And the implication is that the sister's magical powers are transferred with her blessing to their swords. So she is really behind their powers as warriors. Although we don't have much time to go into that, that's the idea. And then we have also the sister offering them water, and that is associated with a sprinkling of water. The women in the story do many things that are magical with water, and they seem to be strongly associated with that, as opposed to association with swords and with tusks, as the wild boar is. Tusks are his kind of sword. The sister is also a dreamer. She sits on her swing, which interestingly probably hangs from the stars. She's a version of the constellation called the Pleiades, or the chteniya in Tamil. And when her brothers come, she shares her dreams and guides them and tells them what she believes is going to happen. It kind of gives them some knowledge of the future. She also feeds them their last meal, and she says, now you're going off to fight the wild boar, but I know through my dreams that you will never come home. And I'm saying, with great sorrow, I'm saying goodbye with this last meal. You may recognize some crossover here with Christian themes, the resurrection with Mary Magdalene as the female, and the last meal, of course, the Last Supper in the Christian tradition. There are overlaps, and I believe those are not accidental. They're part of this communication that was going on with ancient Babylonia from very early times via sailing boats. But now I want to emphasize, besides swords, the other key thing that expresses the heroes' yogic powers is their asceticism. And one key expression of that is they do marry, they marry sisters in a kind of a joint wedding ceremony, one sister for each twin. But part of the marriage ceremony is walking around the sacred fire. And at that point, the bride and the groom are supposed to link their little fingers. Well, these two grooms are so fussy about their virginity and their purity that they won't even touch their bride with a little finger during the wedding ceremony. They get a special silver hook made so that they can circumambulate the fire together, but separated by this silver hook. And then immediately after the wedding, the hero's assistant is asked to take the two women to a separate palace, and he locks the palace door, and those two poor women who are sisters are in that palace forever. They never come out. They never even once meet their husbands. There's never any physical contact, and that is the key point of all this. Yes, it's cruel for them, but it is also supposed to, I believe, the purpose of this is to make sure the brothers are absolutely pure, and that increases their yogic powers. what they do here in this little place where they live on their own is they spin all day long, spin, spin, and spin some more. And that too, I suspect, is a reference to creating a kind of magical protective net, if you like, around their brothers. So they're giving protection, not to their brothers, to their husbands. They're contributing to their husbands' protection and power in that way. So the heroes remain virgins throughout their lives. They are warriors who get their special powers from their sister's blessings and magical feeding events and drinking events when the sister offers them water or sprinkles them. And this is a backstory which we haven't time for, but it's important. They are sons of a mother who was immaculately impregnated by Shiva during her 21-year pilgrimage to Kailasa. Again, you may recognize the idea of immaculate conception also there in Christian tradition, where the husband, while she's on this 21-year pilgrimage, her husband is frozen as a stone to await his wife's return. So he has no part in the conception, but it is, and as it's illustrated by our artist, it's a kind of a beam of light that goes from Shiva's right hand into the womb of the mother, who then births the two twins and a sister. So he puts 3 embryos in the mother's womb. I also think this is more interpretive, but there are many references to the sun and the heroes shining like the sun. Well, there's, of course, an ancient tradition that chariots pulled the sun across the sky. That's how it managed to move from dawn to dusk. And here, I think there's a kind of an emphasis on that, which the artist has nicely captured by making the ears of the 2 horses they ride a very bright yellow, and also a bright shining kind of gear that they wear. It's as if the heroes sitting on the horses' backs are versions of the sun, and they are shining so brightly that the horses' ears and their gear are reflecting that light energy. And one more way in which these 2 heroes are ascetics that I think represents or references the medieval idea of yogi powers is that they hold their breath. There are 2 points in the story where they hear something shocking, and their reaction is to hold their breath for nearly an hour. Well, that's, of course, only can be done by someone who has special powers. So that's another way in which these men are like yogis. But this is also very interesting tradition that maybe not many people outside of Tamil Nadu know about. There's an old tradition of men who are devotees being raised by hooks through the muscles in their back and then rotated around a pole. It's sort of like a carnival pole, but here the men, instead of riding in little baskets or whatever, are being flown as if they are like birds who are going to rise up into the sky. And one of my special students who's listening today has just sent me some wonderful photographs. She's from an island off the north end of Sri Lanka, where she has just 2 years ago witnessed and photographed exactly this kind of event. And if we look back a little bit into history, there's some illustrations provided by the British of men doing the same thing, being sort of rotated around a high pole with hooks in their backs. But this one is significant because he's carrying a sword. So we have there the idea that this man is a warrior, and he's also, of course, some kind of yogi, or he wouldn't be able to withstand this much pain and pressure on his back. And the pictures I recently received from Sri Lanka also show a man like this. He's carrying a veil, which is a kind of a spear, a big spear associated with Lord Murugan. The same idea that he has warrior qualities. So we see the idea that warriors, when they die, have this special ability to fly, to convert their bodies into birds, or to be flown by birds up into the sky. And the old texts reference the fact that they fly beyond the sun. They fly into a kind of the black void of the stars that is beyond the sun. These are some ancient Mesolithic rock carvings. That means they dated from somewhere between 9,000 and 4,000 BC. A little bit north of the region we're talking about, but I think the idea is similar. We see here some kind of dying event. Is not very clear. There's a man here with 2 legs, 2 arms, and a head. This is probably the sun, and he's being converted, as I read this rock drawing, into some kind of bird that is flying upwards towards the sun. Another rock carving, the same idea, a spear or arrow, perhaps a flowered arrow, and the character who was a warrior converted into a bird who's going to fly upward. That's speculation, but it's suggestive of the same ideas. In our story, the artist has illustrated this with the image of an eagle, and that is Garuda, the eagle on which Vishnu flies up and down from the sky. And the eagle appears just as the men right below him are falling on their swords. So they're getting ready to fly. And then Vishnu appears, and we saw the image. He puts the little flames in his box, and he gets on his flying Garuda, who is represented here as a human with a kind of eagle-like qualities. And also, interestingly, in this close-up of his head in other illustrations, he also looks as if he reflects the light of the sun. He's carried upwards to Kailas. And this on the left is an illustration from an ancient Babylonian constellation, where at the end of the year, right before the winter solstice, where the sun is reborn, we have the image of an eagle, a constellation called the Eagle and the Dead Man, carrying the spirit of the dead up into the sky in time for the rebirth of the sun at the winter solstice. And that references the Pongal festival in Tamil Nadu, which is called Makara Sankranti, which means the winter solstice. There's one other illustration I find very interesting, again, Babylonian. It comes from this wonderful book on Babylonian star lore, which I've referenced many times. This is the killing of Humbaba, who is actually the wild boar in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which there's a lot of similarities between the Epic of Gilgamesh and this folk epic from Kongu Nadu. And as Humbaba is being killed, we see an eagle flying down and what looks like the spirit of his body arising from his feet, perhaps even the heel of his foot, up as if it's going to, eagles come down and it's going to take the spirit back up to the sky. This is an Akkadian image from approximately 2300 BC. So these themes seem to prevail and permeate the story in very interesting ways. Also, very early in the story, one of the first events is a group of wandering cows who are very hungry because there's been a drought in a neighboring region. And they wander into the Kongu area. They find the ancestor, the grandfather of the heroes, has just planted and is ready to harvest his first sugarcane field. They smell the sugarcane, because of course you can smell sugarcane from quite a distance. They come over thinking, finally some food. And they find a wicked fence. but these are all women. And one of them, who's kind of the leader, says, come on, sisters, we can do this. We can jump this fence. And so she encourages them, and they try to jump the fence in order to feed. And alas, they fall on these spears. Again, they are speared or punched by these very wicked spikes on the fence, and their spirits then rise to heaven. If you look closely, you can see the kind of transparent spirits of the cows have come to Shiva's council chambers in Kailas, and he's greeting them and asking them, hello, my cows, my dear cows, what is your problem? And they complain bitterly and say, this mean farmer down on earth built this wicked fence, and we were hungry, we were, looking for food because there'd been a drought, we smelled the sugarcane, and we tried to jump the fence, and we died on those spikes. How mean that farmer was. The Shiva is angry at that news, and he curses the entire heroic family to 7 generations with no offspring. A very, very mean and a very painful curse. Well, that's a two-sided curse, because at the same time that he says the heroes are not going to have any, what he means is natural offspring born of the wife of the male lineage. So there has to be a workaround, because there's actually 3 generations in the story. And the workaround is that the gods provide an immaculate conception. And that's indeed how the hero's mother becomes pregnant, as I mentioned earlier. So it's a very interesting kind of interrelationship between the death by spearing of these sacred cows and the generation, because of that spearing of the cows, of a new life which is going to be immaculately placed in the womb of a woman. So she's not bearing children by her husband, she's bearing children with a divine heritage. And that also is a theme that goes way, way back, that the source of life is actually in the skies, and that after the embryo forms, it is transported to earth and placed in a woman's womb. And it's a little bit like the folk tradition we have now, that the children are brought in those sort of white slings that a bird carries down to the sky, from the sky. Okay, another interesting theme in the story, again relating to sisters and the sun and liquids. So this is, I'm kind of jumping around in this story, but if you can imagine that after, this is the sister of the heroes with her 7-tiered pots. And after her brothers die, she goes searching for them in the forest. And that alone, she's very brave. She's alone, she wanders in the forest by herself. And she eventually comes across this woman who is a sun maiden. She's called Arukandi. And she is sitting on a high pillar, and Vishnu is aiding her. And she is able to bring down liquids from this encounter with Vishnu and with the heavens. She brings down liquids which somehow are in her body, and she then, with her right hand, she fills the pots of the sister of the heroine with those liquids. So her pots are now full of liquids that have come essentially from the sun and from the sky via a female, via the hero's sister. She also is able to get a wand, which is important in helping to resurrect various characters, including her brothers, and at several points she gets fire. All of these things come via the sister and via a source that is in heaven, generally from Shiva and Vishnu. I think underlying that idea that liquids and birth and embryos and life originate in the sky is coming from a background understanding of the way the cycles of climate work on Earth, which is the sun dries up the earth, which is very obvious in Tamil Nadu, it's very hot when the sun is out. And that dries everything, including the bodies of human beings whose lifeless bodies at death dry up quickly. But after these liquids, which the sun is absorbing every day into the atmosphere, which is a real event, of course, the moisture rises upwards and it builds up as clouds in the sky. And eventually those clouds become so laden with moisture that they begin, thunder and lightning begin, evidence of this life, this energy in the clouds, and then you get a heavy rainfall. So there is particularly the sun and heat is associated with men, but also with yogis and both male and female versions of yogis. And that heat rises up, forms clouds, and then eventually comes back down in the guise of a blessing through these waters that are gifted back to Earth in a cycle. And the sun is the ultimate source of that new life energy, but the sun partners with the moon, and the moon is like the brother-in-law who's married to the sun's sister. This is referencing Shiva, relationship between Shiva and Vishnu in South Indian mythology. But particularly important, the sun has a dark or mysterious side, the night sun, when it passes through a tunnel or a cave that runs under or through the earth. And the great black boar, Komban, of course, is like a magical black sun. His back hairs are used, I believe, even though we didn't get any evidence for that today, but I have run across some evidence, I don't know much, that they are used in Ayurvedic medicine. And you can imagine how a boar can be related to a black sun because of all those stiff black hairs that stand up on the wild boar's back. So he's kind of like the night sun. And there's a very interesting episode when the heroes are hunting the boar before they kill him. He sleeps in a cave, and he's like a yogi as well. And the assistant to the twin hero sneaks into his cave and pulls out some of his back hairs. So here he is pulling out the back hairs. Then he runs out of the cave before the boar wakes up, and he runs through the land carrying, if you can see the back hairs there are, held in his right hand just behind his hip. Here again, you see the boar's black hairs, and I've made them a little clearer here. The black boar hairs that the hero is running back, the hero's assistant is running back to the heroes with this wonderful magical energy. It's also interesting that the assistant to the heroes is like a yogi because he has this special horn. And the medieval Nath yogis used to blow these horns that they wore around their neck. And he actually uses this horn, which you can see here. He's talking to a bird at this point, asking about Komban. But when he finds Komban, he blows his horn and is able to put Komban to sleep with his horn. And it's a magical horn. The musical notes are said to come out backwards. And so lullaby that he plays to put him to sleep comes out backwards. And there are lots of indications like that he is a yogi, but he's kind of like black magic. He's able to do things in reverse. He's also many times said to be running behind the heroes. The heroes are riding these glorious horses that are reflecting the bright sun. He's not allowed to ride a horse because of his low status, but he has magical powers. And if you can imagine, he can run as fast as a horse can gallop. So he keeps right up with the heroes, but is just a little bit behind them. So he's in many ways like a bird. This is wonderful. These two illustrations taken from a wonderful book on rock art in ancient India. These are from Madhya Pradesh. They're also Mesolithic. presumed to be from about 8,000 BC. And what you see here, this magical divine boar, according to the author of the book, when the boar is decorated like this, it means it's divine. And these images on the boar's back are people, maybe magicians or whatever, pulling out the back hairs of the boar to use in magic. And there's two images of that in this book. They're climbing up the tail of the boar and then pulling out hairs, which you can actually see the little hairs there on his back. So there's something very special about the boar's back hairs, which make him like a sun, but a night version of the sun. I also want to tell you about the elder brother, who is the less fierce, less warlike, more wiser, more like Yudhishthira in the Mahabharata. And he is challenged at one point by an ally of the forest hunters. They're having a dispute, and the ally of the hunters says, I want you to undergo a truth test. If you say you're telling the truth, you should be able to swim up this channel. This is an irrigation channel. It's, if you can imagine a great irrigation pond, and there's a sluice gate at one end. And when you open the sluice a little bit, which is like a vertical board, you open it a little bit, the water rushes under the board, creating a torrent that's going down to irrigate the fields. So the hero is challenged twice, once to swim down with the current through this sluice, which is not that difficult to do if you can swim. But then he's asked to turn around and swim up against the current back into the holding tank that has the irrigation water. And the second part of the challenge is, of course, very difficult to swim upward against such a torrent. The hero manages to do that. And I wondered for years, well, what's this all about? Well, what's the point of this? And I suddenly realized, I think the hero is being challenged to prove that he is like the sun, that he sinks downwards at dusk, at night, goes into a dark tunnel, and then the next morning, to get back up on the other side of the earth, on the east side, he has to swim up against that torrent. Going upwards through the water is not easy. And the fact that the hero succeeds in this magical test suggests to me that he is proving that he is like a great sun who sets at dusk and then swims up at dawn the next day to rise again in the east. So again, interesting ideas that reference the sun. Here's an image of Komban, the great boar, and I'm suggesting here his relationship to the Sumerian Humbaba in the Epic of Gilgamesh, who was a huge forest boar-like creature. And this is the Babylonian constellation. I've looked and looked for references to boar constellation in the Indian constellation system, and I haven't found one. I think it goes back to the ancient Babylonian tradition, where the stars and the sun and the moon are very important general frames. Here again, in this rock art, we see a deified boar. In one scene, he's chasing people, and you can see the wonderful back hairs that he has. But in another scene, he's standing on his nose, and one has to wonder why, what would ever inspire an artist, a rock art carver, to put a boar on his nose. It's a totally unnatural condition. Well, I think it's because it's what he looks like in the sky. The way the stars are mapped to form the boar in the sky made him look like he was standing on his nose. So we know this is Earth on the left and this is sky on the right. And he's also associated with the crab and with the summer solstice and many other things we haven't time to go into. Finally, I want to suggest that both the heroes and the wild boar have this strong association with a female who is always chaste, but who behaves as if she were a kind of love object, certainly a loving mother or wife. Is a little bit ambiguous. There's never any sexual thing, relationship implied in the text, but the story itself, you can hardly not think that that theme is somehow there, because first of all, these are two adult men, handsome heroes, and their sister. There's nobody else in this palace. The parents are dead. The three of them live there together, and she does all these kind things to help her brothers as a very special sister. Similarly, the wild boar has a kind of sister in this woman, Viratangal, who we met at the Kali temple earlier. That's the Kali temple there behind the boar, and she is said to feed kombu and rice every day. She's like the mother or sister who is taking care of him. So there are these magical, very powerful women who stand behind both sides in this confrontation between the farm heroes and the protective warrior of the forest. There are also interesting sounds associated with all of this. The sound of the drum, a deep, dark sound that is when the drum is beaten to announce the great boar hunt, and then the light tinkle of a little brass bell, which is sounded in contrast with the deep voice of the drum as the heroes' spirits are honored. And we now know that they have risen up to Kailas in heaven. So in conclusion, I want to suggest that we have here an idea that the farm fields and of course the ox carts and the carrying of the produce are very important to civilization, but there is also the wild boar in the forest who is associated, I think, with lamp oil and, light in darkness, if you like. And then the epic, there's a big confrontation between these two. Vishnu switches sides, so he doesn't allow the forest hunters to be defeated and obliterated. There's no Holocaust or ethnic cleansing. The heroes of the forest are allowed, protected by Vishnu, to survive. And so he redresses this balance. And there's something about a story I haven't had time to tell. When Shiva puts the embryos of these two heroes and their sister in the mother's womb, at the same time, he says to Vishnu, who's there as part of the scene, "Give me your conch shell. I'm going to keep your conch shell with me for the 16 years you are on Earth protecting the heroes. And when you bring their spirits back at the end of their lives, which will be only 16 years, when you bring the spirits back to me, I will give you back your conch shell." And that exchange happens the moment that Vishnu carries those three little lights in his golden box back up into the sky. So it's kind of an interlude, a period of conflict and imbalance, if you like, during the 16 years where the farmers are trying to cut down the forest and convert it into plowed lands. But at the end, Vishnu redresses the balance and says, now a new era will begin. And it's as if this was the end of the Kali Yuga, and now a new set of yugas is going to start. And we see that in the ending song, a lovely song, which promises a new era with fresh growth and a pristine restart. This will be the next cycle of yugas yet to come. And I'm trying to express that here in the banyan tree with all the new roots and the birds in their nests starting a new cycle of life. And I believe this can be used as a kind of relevant message for the present state of our overheated and overviolent world, that there is something going on. And I didn't have a chance to say, but should have, that the head of the wild boar is treated like a seed. And you see that especially in the local rituals which are related to the story, where when a boar is sacrificed in front of the goddess at a temple, his head is cut off with one big slash of a knife, and then his head is put in a hole where there was a post previously. The post is pulled up, the head is put in that hole, and it is like planting a seed, that the head becomes the seed which creates the new epic, the new set of yugas yet to come. And that the epic then is advocating for new seeds, replanting, and a rebalancing of things so that life can continue. So that's the end. Thank you very much.